Well, good evening, everyone. This is Ann Malcolmus from Hallelujah Diet. I know I don't sound like Paul because Paul is our tech guy, so he's the behind-the-scenes guy tonight. So we are going to tag team this one tonight. So we want to welcome all of you, and we're so glad that you joined us this evening. We have a great presentation tonight by Dr. Amy Joy Lanou. I hope I said that properly. Dr. Lanou, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I want to give them just a little bit of information about what we're doing tonight and who you are and how excited we are to have all of us together this evening. But I think first what I really want to do is I want us all just to take a few minutes and bow our heads and just praise the Lord. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for giving us the opportunity to be here together this evening. It's amazing to us how you can bring all people from all over the world all together under this. And thank you for giving us such a wonderful speaker and a great topic. And we are so grateful that you've given us her so we can learn as much as we can from her. And we just thank you and honor you and hope this information is going to be helpful for many, many people. And we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. So Amy Joy, Dr. Lanou, is Chair and Professor of Health and Wellness for the University of North Carolina, Asheville. A lot of people know Asheville, and they know how beautiful it is, and I'm sure Dr. Lanou can appreciate hearing us extol the virtues of where she is living. She currently teaches nutrition, food politics, and nutrition policy, health communication, as well as senior seminar in health promotion. All of those topics sound extremely interesting to me, and I'd love to learn more about what she does. Her research interests include nutrition for the prevention of chronic disease, nutrition and bone health, and how experiential food education impacts what individuals know, think, and do with respect to dietary choices. Dr. Lanou publishes regularly on the relationship between vegetarian diet and dairy products and health. In addition, she does collaborative research on engaged interdisciplinary ways of teaching and learning. She's the author of Building Bone Vitality and Healthy Eating for Life for Children. Dr. Lanou, we are so excited to have you here. Thank you again for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Can you give us just an idea of what it is we're going to be talking about today, and then let's just get started so we can hear all you have to share with us.
Well, I'm going to be talking about what we know about the nutritional support of bone health. How can we eat our way to better bones?
That sounds fascinating. We're so eager, so I'm just going to let this one go to you, and let's all hear what she has to say.
Great. So I'm going to address three key questions today. One is, do milk and other dairy products promote bone health and prevent osteoporosis? And then, what are the most useful strategies for building and maintaining bone health? And then, hopefully, if we have time, I'll also address whether cow's milk dairy products at currently recommended levels are causing harm. So first, a little bit about bones. Bones are a complex system. They're a matrix of collagen, water, a bunch of different minerals, and they're affected by a number of vitamins and other nutrients as well. One thing that's really important to remember is that bone is a living tissue. Sometimes we get this idea in our head that bone is, that we get a skeleton by a full-size skeleton by the time we're 21 or 22 years old, and then from there on we're just trying to hang on to that skeleton. Well, actually, bone turnover is much slower than the turnover of, say, your skin cells or your lung cells, but we get roughly a new skeleton, they estimate, about once every 11 years. So that means that bone cells are being made anew and broken down on a regular basis. So with that as a sort of mini introduction, I'm going to start with this question about whether, because one of the things that we've learned all our lives, from media, from the U.S. government, from textbooks, you name it, is that we need to drink cow's milk in order and eat other dairy products to promote bone health and to prevent osteoporosis, which is age-related bone loss that can cause debility in people in later life. And I want us to take on this notion, but first let's talk a little bit about the historical perspective and why or how we've thought about bone health from a nutritional perspective and how we've thought about treating it and preventing it. And largely the focus has been on calcium and dairy supplementation, so adding more dairy products to the diet, adding more milk to the diet, or adding calcium to the diet. We've also done, typically now, women definitely, and sometimes also men after age 50 sort of regularly get screened for bone mineral density changes, whether or not there's been significant loss of minerals from the bone or the bone is getting airier and less dense. And when they see that, historically the perspective has been to give a drug, give a pharmacologic agent to help slow, quote unquote, that loss of bone or loss of mineral from the bone. And these are often, the drugs used for this are often bisphosphonates. This picture, I don't know if you can see it up close, but it's of course Kermit the Frog saying milk isn't just for tadpoles. And I always laugh at this one and, you know, sort of the got milk ads in general, but this one in particular because, first of all, Kermit is a puppet. Second of all, Kermit is a frog, and neither puppets nor frogs drink any kind of mammalian milk, cows or otherwise. And he is promoting, with this ad, he's promoting the use of cow's milk for older adults. So a little bit more about background, some of the background assumptions that have kind of got us to this place of drinking more milk, measuring bone mineral density, and then using medicines to treat bone mineral density loss, I think makes some sense. If you think about bone as, or if you think about osteoporosis as calcium loss from the bone or mineral loss from the bone, then you would make the assumption that adding more calcium to the body, like this picture where you might imagine just pouring milk into the body, it's going straight into the bones and making the bones stronger. So if so more calcium equals stronger bones. We know that cow's milk is a rich source of calcium. There's a lot of calcium in cow's milk. So the assumption has been over time, more milk equals osteoporosis prevention. But what I want to do now is spend a few minutes kind of talking about the evidence for that. And I also want you to think about what might not be right about that. Why isn't that picture that you can see on the screen, why isn't that correct? It really doesn't happen that we just pour milk into our bodies and it goes straight into our bones and makes our bones stronger. So what are the things that get in the way of that? Well, first of all, you have to get the nutrients in the milk absorbed across the stomach into the bloodstream. Once it's in the bloodstream, there's got to be a reason to move it from the bloodstream to the bone. So drinking milk doesn't necessarily mean calcium is making it into bone. So that's, I think, an important thing to think about as we go forward. One of the things that we've known for quite a long time, you can see the dates on these references back to 1985, early 90s. We've known for a long time that hip fracture rates, or the end point of osteoporosis that is most problematic and causes the most disability, is highest in countries with high calcium and high dairy product intake, which is opposite of what you would be true if those assumptions about just pouring milk into the body would make our bones stronger, what you would believe if you believed those assumptions. And the opposite is true. Countries that consume little or no milk, dairy or calcium supplements, have fracture rates that are 50 to 70% lower than we do here in the U.S., where calcium intake, cow's milk intake, and calcium intake are actually quite high. So there's something wrong with the picture. And this is an example of one of those studies just showing the relationship. And this is an epidemiologic study where they were looking at calcium intake and fracture rate in a number of different countries around the world. And you can see that as calcium intake gets higher, the rate of hip fracture increases across countries. Notice Norway and Sweden with very high fracture rates and some of the highest calcium consumptions as well. If you take a look at all of the studies that have been done in the literature on the relationship between dietary calcium and hip fracture or other sites of osteoporotic fracture risk, you find that fewer than a third of those studies show a benefit of dairy or calcium intake on bones. And many of them show no reduced risk or even an increased risk with adding calcium or adding dairy to the diet relative to fracture rate. And so this I think really turns that notion of we need to consume 2 to 3 servings of cow's milk a day or dairy products a day in order to take good care of bones. And the literature is really not holding that to be true. A couple other pieces of evidence to support this notion. One is there was a very well done meta-analysis, which is kind of a combination of a bunch of big studies statistically combined, and they look at the outcome or the results from that. And they found 2 things that I think are really important, that the studies where they looked at people over time, that's those prospective cohort studies, suggest that calcium intake is not significantly associated with hip fracture risk in women or men. So no matter how much calcium you consume, it doesn't change your risk. And then in those studies, and then within randomized control trials, these are the ones that are considered the sort of strongest type of evidence. They showed no reduction in hip fracture risk with calcium supplementation, and the authors noted that an increased risk is possible. So maybe that might be true for adults, but what about kids? And actually it was work on children, the relationship between calcium and children's bones, that got me interested in thinking about this question. And this is an example of a study that gives evidence that it doesn't matter how much, over a certain amount, it doesn't matter how much calcium youth are consuming, either relative to their bone density when they become adults. So this is a study done by Tom Lloyd at University of Pennsylvania, longtime bone researcher, and he found that as calcium intake varied between about 500 milligrams a day up to 1,500 milligrams a day, as he followed kids, young women between the ages of 12 and 20, he found that there was no association between the amount of calcium they consumed and their bone density at adulthood, at early adulthood. And in fact, the only thing that in his studies that he measured that he found did have a positive effect on bone was levels of achievable levels of exercise and fitness. So, and what he was saying by adding achievable in there is that this is, doesn't have to be sport. It could be regular physical activity due to their work, or just play, active play, or sort of lifetime fitness type activities. Similarly, I did a review article 15 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago now, with Dr. Neil Barnard, and we looked at did a review of all of the papers at that time that had had been testing that relationship between dairy or dietary calcium intake and measures of bone health in children and young adults. And what we found was that 28 of the 37 studies that were in existence that met certain criteria found no relationship between dairy and bone health. And the ones that did, the 9 reports that did show a positive effect on bone health from the consumption of dairy products or calcium. With those, sometimes the effects were confounded by vitamin D. So in the United States, we add vitamin D to cow's milk, and then you're getting both the cow's milk and the vitamin D, and the vitamin D might have been causing that positive effect. The other thing that I want to say about those 9 studies is the effects were tiny. In one of the best controlled studies, they doubled calcium intake among the young women, and they tested bone mineral density at 5 different sites. They found about a 0.5% increase at one of those 5 sites. So this is not an overwhelming positive effect. And I wanted to draw your attention to a much more recent study where that was done in Sweden, where people were followed for over 100,000 people were followed for 10 to 20 years, and the conclusions from this study are, I think, quite striking. A higher consumption of milk in women and men is not accompanied by a lower risk of fracture, and instead may be associated with a higher rate of death. What? Consuming more calcium, consuming more dairy products is associated with a higher risk of death in their study. And then they very gently and carefully say, our results may question the validity of recommendations to consume high amounts of milk to prevent fragility fractures. I think so. I think I would agree that that those results would question that validity. But it is important to know they found no improvement in risk of fracture, and the people who were higher dairy consumers had a higher risk of mortality. So what do we think is going on here? Well, I think certainly my first point here is too much attention has been given to milk or dairy for promoting bone health. Yes, bones need calcium. There are plenty of foods that contain calcium. They don't need as much calcium as our U.S. dietary guidelines recommend. And milk has, in addition to having calcium, maybe has something else in it that is reducing the potential positive benefit of the calcium itself on bone. And maybe maybe we're just looking in the wrong place for nutritional benefits for bone. Maybe we need to be looking at overall dietary patterns, not just at specific nutrients like calcium or vitamin D. And I think we really need to be thinking about what kind of strategies can we find that would put and keep calcium and other nutrients in bones. Not just get calcium into the body like drinking a glass of milk might, but rather how do we get bones to want to take up calcium and keep it rather than calcium leaching out of the bones and going out of the body through the urine. So just briefly, a little bit about dietary patterns. And I imagine many of you have thought about this already, but the evidence for health benefit appears to be stronger when foods are put together in a synergistic dietary pattern than it is for individual foods or food constituents. So this is what urging sort of move away from specific nutrients or even specific sort of wonder foods and think about what are the foods and beverages and air and everything else that we're actually bathing our body cells with, because each cell is remade in the environment. Each cell in a person's body is remade in that environment that we are bathing the cells with by what we consume and breathe. So something I think to think about. And there are some other things about the dietary patterns of people with high hip fracture rates that we might want to pay attention to. One of these is, I think, one of the keys to why we might have this calcium paradox, and that is that in countries where animal protein intake is higher or protein from animal sources is higher, hip fracture rate is also higher. When you see here, I had you look at Sweden and Norway on the previous graph that looked like this. If you look at the United States and the United Kingdom as well, all very high dietary animal protein and also quite high hip fracture rates. Uh-oh, what happened?
You want to just go to the next one? That looks like a better one.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay.
That should be better.
Okay. Thank you. So this is another picture kind of looking at dietary pattern or trying to help us understand the relationship of dietary pattern to bone health or hip fracture rate. And the first picture shows animal protein intake compared to hip fracture incidence. And you can see that same relationship that we saw in the previous slide. But if you look at vegetable protein intake, as vegetable protein intake goes up, hip fracture incidence goes down. I'll say that again. As vegetable protein goes up, hip fracture incidence goes down. So maybe there's something about diets that are rich in animal protein that are problematic for bones. And the last picture is just showing that if you actually look at the ratio of vegetable to animal protein, you see that really dramatic effect. There have been other studies looking at this notion of the proportion of animal protein to vegetable protein. One of these was done by Selmayr, and she found that women with a high ratio of animal to vegetable protein, so those who had a lot of animal protein compared to vegetable protein, had a higher rate of bone loss than those with a low ratio. And they had a greater risk of hip fracture, over 3.5 times higher risk of hip fracture if they had lots of animal protein and a small amount of vegetable protein in their diet. So that's pretty telling. So what can we do? What can we do to take care of bones? One of the things that makes really good sense, if you follow the line of reasoning from this research, is to avoid protein from animal sources. If you're not in a position to be able to avoid it, protein from animal sources, certainly at least limit it. And why would we want to do that? Well, the theory behind it is that animal protein, foods that contain animal proteins, makes the blood a little bit more acidic. The body doesn't like blood acidity to go out of neutrality. So what our blood cells do, or what our body does, is pull calcium compounds out of bone to neutralize that acidity, and then the calcium gets sent out in the urine. So the higher the animal protein in the diet, the more likely we're dumping calcium, both that was eaten and also calcium that may be already in bone, out of the body through the urine. And that last point is one that I've already said, so I'm going to skip that. Other things we can do, and I've not showed you any data on this, but I'll go ahead and tell you about some of the other things that we can do, is to limit salty foods. Higher salt also increases the loss of calcium from the body, so lowering salt intake will reduce bone breakdown and calcium loss. Similarly, and these are, of course, just common sense, healthy things that people do that we can do to help take care of our bodies, but also help take care of our bones. We know that people who are users of tobacco, especially tobacco smokers, lose more calcium from their body than those who are non-smokers. So avoiding salty foods, avoiding animal protein, avoiding smoking, and then high levels of caffeine consumption also increase loss of calcium from the body. It's not as strong of an effect by any means as the animal protein effect, but it is worth paying attention to. On the other side, what can we do to promote bone building? Well, one of the things, one of my favorite recommendations is to eat lots of fruits and vegetables. They are rich in nutrients that promote bone health. Vitamin C, nutrients that we don't think about as bone nutrients, vitamin C, vitamin K, potassium, magnesium, these are all nutrients that are rich in fruits and vegetables. In fact, there's no vitamin C and very little vitamin K in any animal products. And vitamin C is really important to help maintain the integrity of the spongy structure of bone, of the collagen that the minerals are attached to and the cells are tucked into. So eating lots of fruits and vegetables for those nutrients that are important to bone. And then also vegetables are great because they don't increase loss of calcium from the body because they are alkaline forming. When you consume fruits and vegetables, after they go through the digestive tract and they make it into the bloodstream, they bring some of those alkalizing nutrients with them or compounds with them that we would get from bone if we had a more acidic dietary pattern. We also have seen now a large number of studies that show that both fruit and vegetable intake is linked to positive effects on bones. Both fruit and vegetable intake is linked to positive effect on bones. So the higher the fruit and vegetable intake, the lower the fracture rate, the higher the bone mineral density across a variety of different studies. And if there's a review paper written back in 2011 showing that taken together, this makes a whole lot of sense. These authors say that fruit and vegetable, the studies on fruits and vegetables offer solid documentation that positive changes to bone health are achievable through a diet rich in fruits and vegetables with essentially no risk, but rather many added health benefits, which of course I'm sure you all are aware of. Why, we talked about this a little bit, why might animal protein increase calcium excretion? We know the data is clear that is the case. And my third point here is that there's a linear association between changes in urinary calcium and dietary acid load. So the higher the acid load of the diet, and one of the main drivers of that is dietary animal protein, the more calcium is lost in the urine. One more thing that I'm sure many of you already know and probably are already doing is that a really good way to promote bone building is by incorporating daily exercise. Exercise, I always say, exercise gives bones a reason to live. Just like our muscle cells, when we work out, we strengthen our muscle cells, we make new muscle cells. The same thing is what happens with bone. If you can stress the bone and the bone cells, then you will stimulate new bone growth or the making of new bone cells. And they often talk about weight-bearing activities. Don't think it has to be just weightlifting. Anything that you do upright is weight-bearing for your spine, so dancing or walking your dog or working in a garden. If you do, one of the areas of concern is wrists. So it's also good if you're a walker to think about doing some things that also stress the bones in your wrist. Baking bread could be one. Any kind of handwork, downward dog in yoga, a lot of yoga poses put some stress on the wrists as well. So there's lots of kinds of activities that can do this work in addition to weightlifting. The research on exercise for bone building is fantastic. Very high rates of the studies showing positive effect on bone. And remember I said there was a 0.5% difference with the best of those dairy consumption studies for among youth. The exercise studies show 50% reduction in fracture risk. So we're talking about much, much larger magnitude of effect. And then it is important to get enough vitamin D. Remember that vitamin D is a hormone that is produced in your skin by the action of sunlight on your skin cells. And vitamin D is important to help the calcium that is in your blood get into your bones. I mentioned the importance of fruits and vegetables. That's because there are 17 different nutrients that are important to bones. This is a list of those nutrients that are important to bone. And interestingly, one of the nutrients that's important to bone is protein. When people have very low protein diets, they do have increased problems with bone loss. What is a very low protein diet? Not meeting your basic needs of somewhere between 6 and 10% of calories. So it's possible to have too little protein for bones. Best source of protein for bones is going to be protein from plant sources. Get the calcium that you do eat from plant sources. Greens and beans are both great. You can also use calcium fortified foods, but ideally you would get your calcium from plant sources. How much is enough? There's still some questions about this, but I would say at least a little over 500 milligrams a day, and upwards to as much as 700 milligrams a day. I don't think anybody needs to be taking 1,000, 1,200, or 1,400 milligrams like a lot of our recommendations would say, especially for postmenopausal women. One of the reasons is that we've now seen a number of studies showing increased risk of heart attack with calcium supplementation of 1,000 milligrams a day or higher. So be careful if you are supplementing calcium. It's a good idea to limit the amount that you supplement to under 1,000 milligrams a day, and then also if you are using calcium supplements to divide them over multiple times of day so that you're not taking that whole dose at once. So you might have a 250 in the morning and a 250 with your evening meal, something like that. So this is a kind of a summary slide with a little bit more detail of the nutrition recommendations that I would make for people who are at high risk of osteoporosis or who are living with osteoporosis. Get off the dairy products that consume somewhere between that 500 to 700 milligrams of calcium per day from plant sources. Avoid total consumption over 1,000. I just mentioned that. If your dietary habits, if you don't eat enough food or for other reasons your dietary habits are inadequate, then low-dose supplementation or use of fortified foods is okay, up to about 700 milligrams total. Know your vitamin D status. This is really important. If low, then I recommend vitamin D supplementation or figuring out safe ways to spend more time in the sun. Make sure fruit and vegetable servings are high, ideally much higher than the 5 a day that's recommended by our dietary guidelines, and if possible, include at least one cabbage family vegetable every day. Consume enough protein, but not too much protein from plant sources. And there's under that is just some specifics about how you figure out how much is the right amount. Plant foods are better sources of calcium. The calcium absorption fractions, that's the percentage of the calcium that's absorbed when you consume foods, is much higher for the beans and the greens than it is for cow's milk or other or any fortified sources. Those are down around 30%, whereas the cabbage family vegetables in particular range from 40 to almost 60% of the calcium in them is absorbed. So the main keys to bone vitality are choose a diet built from fruits, vegetables, and legumes and other whole plant foods. Consume adequate but not too much protein, and get that from plant sources. Exercise daily to give bones a reason to strengthen and stay strong, and go outside and play. I seem to have run through my time. Anne, you might want, maybe you can step in here and tell me whether I should run through these last slides or whether I need to stop now.
Oh my goodness, you're doing so well. Let's keep going.
Okay. So I had one additional question, and that was this question about whether cow's milk products at currently recommended levels are causing harm. And I would say, I'll give you a hint ahead of time, yes, but I'll just show you a little bit of evidence about that. First, let me mention that there's a reason why we drink so much cow's milk. It has been heavily promoted by corporate interests and government interests in the United States for many, many years, about 100 years now. And we think it makes us stronger. We're passionate about it. We love cheese, right? And there's even been a series of ads suggesting that if we consume more dairy products, we'll get thinner. And I just think that is such an interesting idea when you think about the fact that cow's milk is a nutritional package designed for the growth of baby mammals. Why would something that can help a baby cow go from about 50 or 60 pounds when it's born in a matter of months to several hundred pounds, why would adding that to the body of another mammal help them get thinner? It just makes no sense at all. So I do like to ask this question, what's right with dairy products? It is a nutritional package designed for growth, made by the mammalian mother for its mammalian babies. And I will say right now that mother's milk or human breast milk is the right food for mammalian babies. And when babies have been weaned off of that, there is no need to add in milk of other mammalian mothers. But all mammalian babies benefit from that nutritional package designed for growth. It's energy and nutrient dense, and they're certainly readily available. They're heavily marketed, like those images I showed you on the previous slide. And right now, they're the primary source of calcium in U.S. diets. In other places in the world, there are other foods that are the primary source of calcium. For example, in Mexico, the primary source of calcium in the diets of people living in Mexico are tortillas. You wouldn't think of tortillas as a high calcium food, but because, like us with dairy products, because tortillas are integrated into, and more than one oftentimes, integrated into the meals all across the day, even though the calcium levels in each tortilla is quite low, by the time you add it up, it's the primary source of calcium. So it's just something to think about. We hear that all the time. The main source of calcium in U.S. diets is, and yes, but that's because they're readily available and heavily marketed, not because it's the best source of calcium by any means. Many of you will be familiar with this space. This is Dr. T. Colin Campbell. Years ago, I was sitting in his lecture of his in at Cornell University when he was teaching his vegetarian nutrition course, and I saw him show slide after slide of evidence that the consumption of cow's milk by humans and by other animals that aren't cows was harmful to the physiologies of those humans and animals. And that started me thinking about this question. Oh my gosh, I was a nutrition teacher. I was teaching at a neighboring university. And what if I was recommending a product to people that is doing more harm than good? And it really shook me. Do we need to still be worrying about this? Absolutely. If you look at this graph, it shows that total cheese consumption has jumped almost tripled since 1970, and it's gone up almost 3 times since 1970. That's very worrisome because cheese is so high in animal protein and so high in animal fat, especially saturated fat. Let me just mention a few things that I always like to say when I have an opportunity. One, milk, other than mother's milk for the babies of that species, milk is not a necessary food. All the nutrients in milk and dairy products are readily available in other whole foods, and I will argue that consuming dairy at recommended quantities raises a number of concerns. Some of those concerns are increased risk of prostate, breast, and ovarian cancer with 2 or more servings a day of dairy products. Milk and other dairy products are full of substances that promote cancer. The nutritional package is a nutritional package designed for growth. When you're an adult, you don't need to grow anymore. So what is that nutritional package designed for growth going to grow on or going to cause to grow? Maybe non-self or unhealthy changed cells. Milk protein itself is a cancer promoter as well. It's also been associated with milk sugar has been associated with cataract formation, milk protein associated with type 1 diabetes and other autoimmune conditions. Heart disease and type 2 diabetes have been linked to total animal product consumption, but also dairy product consumption because of the fat and now also the high calcium levels in milk. More recent evidence certainly causes stomach and lower gut upset, causes allergy and intolerance symptoms in lots of people, and has been now associated with shorter lifespan as well. And the theory behind that is that the milk sugar itself, when it's broken down into its component parts, one of those sugars, galactose, is causes inflammation in a lot of people. We don't break down or use galactose very well, so it can kind of hang around and cause inflammation. You may be aware that most cheese is 60 to 80% of calories from fat. One of my fluid milk is the #1 source of fat and saturated fat in kids' diets. It's not French fries, it's not burgers, it's not candy bars, it's fluid milk. Why? Because they drink so much of it. Skim milk is high in sugar. Low-fat chocolate milk, this is my favorite, has the same number of grams of sugar as cola ounce per ounce. So an 8-ounce glass of cow's milk, low-fat chocolate milk, and an 8-ounce glass of cola have the same amount of sugar. And then, of course, you know the importance of dairy, and dairy products are fiber-free. On the other side, you're probably aware that dairy-free or limited dairy diets have been used to prevent and treat disease. This is the work of Dr. Esselstyn, Dr. Ornish, Dr. Barnard. We've seen these, and many of you, I'm sure, are aware of this. And then, of course, there's other concerns with our national obsession, if it's fair to say, with consuming cow's milk for health or for bone health. There's a lot of contaminants in milk, and our reliance on dairy as a protein and calcium source is problematic for the environment and obviously also problematic for the animals who are providing us those nutrients. So Is dairy causing harm? I would say yes. For many people, and especially if a person is consuming it at the recommended 2 to 3 or more servings a day, it most likely is causing harm. And many of us who have taken it out of our diet know with our experiments, individual experiments, how much it can help to discontinue the consumption of dairy products. There, I made it. It wasn't 30 minutes, but I made it all the way through.
Well, you did a fantastic job. My goodness, that information. I especially appreciated that chronic disease background. So many people think that milk is much healthier than cola, and you just proved them wrong.
Yes. I mean, at least from a sugar perspective, there are probably some things about cola that are worse. It's full of non-nutrients as well, or things that aren't naturally food. But
sure. Well, if for anybody else out there who has a question for her, now is a good time for you to type it in. I have a few here from people, but I actually have one of my own. We come across so many people nowadays that are under this assumption that raw milk, raw unpasteurized milk, is just so much more beneficial. And I have to ask you, because we hear this again and again, because they think that the information that we're distributing about dairy in general doesn't pertain to them, and they prefer just to drink the raw unpasteurized milk anyway. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, raw milk still has the milk sugar, still has the milk protein, still has the milk, still is fiber-free, still is high in saturated fat. So while there may be some things that are better about it from a whole food perspective, in terms of the links to chronic disease or even the links to inflammatory response, it's still going to be every bit as problematic.
I'm so glad you expressed that. That's so very well articulated, and I think the raw milk purists out there need to hear that. Another question was from someone who said, what if I just had a salad every day? Is that good enough for me to prevent bone problems?
It depends what the overall dietary pattern is and whether or not the salad has acid-forming foods on it. So acid-forming foods are meat, cheeses, fish, processed grains, sugars. So I talked really just about the animal proteins, but if the overall dietary pattern is largely or entirely plant-based, if it's largely whole foods, certainly a salad is a great way to start getting your 6 to 9 servings a day.
6 to 9 servings, fascinating. We totally agree with you, and we know there are so many methods to be able to obtain that large number. I have another question here. What about goat's milk or goat's cheese? Is that considered just as bad as cow's milk or cow's cheese?
So to be perfectly honest, there is not that much literature specifically on goat's milk dairy products. So what I will say is, from a nutritional perspective, the nutritional package is only slightly different between goat's milk and cow's milk. So from that perspective, I would expect there to be similar concerns with high levels of consumption of, so high meaning 2 to 3 or more servings a day. I would expect there to be similar concerns relative to bone and relative to chronic disease with goat's milk, but we do not have that confirmed in the literature. There's just very little research specifically on goat's milk. There's not a lot of populations that drink only goat's milk or goat's milk products.
Absolutely. Good answer. Another question here comes from someone asking about kefir. being fermented, and how does that help? Will that help? Would that be a good option for kefir?
Yeah, so fermentation generally is a good thing relative to the gut microflora. It can be very helpful. I would recommend, though, making kefirs from non-dairy milk rather than dairy milk, because, again, the one thing that it will change is it'll change the sugar. So when there's fermentation of the milk product, the sugars will change. You'll have a lot less lactose in there, so it can be helpful for people who have lactose intolerance, but it doesn't change the fact that it's a high protein, high animal protein, high saturated fat food that contains, that's still a nutritional package designed for growth that could be problematic relative to cancer prevention or other things.
Sure.
So
sure, absolutely.
But just kefir out of something else, or ferment a vegetable for your
absolutely.
probiotics.
Yeah, the value of the kefir can be given in other ways too, just like you said before with the value of the milk. You know, you mentioned before synergy and how valuable that is when it comes to combining various different nutrients as opposed to incidental, one-on-one type of nutrients. Would you suggest then, because I have someone here that's wanting to know, what are your top choices for the best fruits and vegetables to help prevent bone loss? But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, definitely one of the big winners is cabbage family vegetables.
Okay.
So that would be everything from cauliflower to broccoli to turnips, which are a cabbage family vegetable, but you eat the part that's under the ground, to Brussels sprouts, to kale, to collards. Also, all of those are great because they are both alkaline-forming, high in plant-based calcium, and they contain other nutrients that are important for bone. The other thing I would add is citrus or other high vitamin or other vitamin C-rich foods like peppers and strawberries. Vitamin C is really important to bone, and we often don't think about that. So in terms of the alkaline-forming nature, you get the most alkaline-forming nutrients from dried fruit. And we don't eat a lot of dried vegetables, but dried vegetables would be in that category too. So it's great to, if those aren't too calorie dense for you, if your total calories are fine, then dried fruits can be a nice pick-me-up snack that's also very good for bone.
Wonderful. So I have a question here for someone who's 63 years old and has been diagnosed with osteoporosis. She eats a vegan diet. She has lots of exercising. She uses yoga. And she's trying to ask for suggestions on how to help possibly reverse this osteoporosis issue because she's a vegan.
So first, I will answer that question, but first let me say that the estimates for there's a lot of different reasons why people have age-related bone loss, and sometimes it's not the diet. Sometimes it's not activity. Sometimes it's things that are outside of our control, our propensity to have age-related bone loss, for example, that is given to us by our families or passed down from our birth families. Medicines that we might have taken at other points in our lives, things like that. So keep in mind that sometimes we do everything right and you still end up with bone loss as you age. It's, so with that said, the one thing is if the person is particularly, a lot of times people with the 63 is fairly early osteoporosis diagnoses. Sometimes they're quite small-bodied people, slight, thin, often not terribly tall. My grandmother and my mother are both in that category. One thing that you can do is if the exercise is walking, the main exercise that you're doing is walking or jogging or something that's a kind of an upright activity, is start to carry a little bit of weight. The reason bigger people have better bones is because they're heavier. And walking or the same activities puts more stress on the bone than it does, like if a 180-pound person is walking and putting stress on their bones compared to a 110-pound person walking, putting stress on their bones, the 180-pound person is getting a lot more benefit from that exercise. So sometimes I have recommended people to wear a soft backpack and put something, maybe wrapped in a towel or something in the backpack to add to the weight for the spine and for the bones, or you can use a weight belt around the hip. There's also some interesting work that's being done looking at, you can test for the acidity of your urine, and there's some interesting work on that to help you kind of tweak your dietary habits to make sure you're staying on the alkaline side. There are vegan foods that are acid forming. Having a diet that is quite high in processed foods can make the foods more acid forming. And so sometimes moving towards the whole food, and you can, I'm trying to think of the woman's name, it's Susan something, who has done a lot of work with helping people determine how acid forming their diet is. But that's another option.
And I just wanted to add to all of that, our PhD on our staff, Michael Donaldson, did a study on bone health, and while everything that you said is exactly what he's suggesting, he went on to suggest that resistance exercise is extremely important for people that are dealing with osteoporosis. And so I want to make sure it's on our website. It's the study that talks about bone health and osteoporosis. So that's a great study. He probably will also identify the importance of the vitamin D3 and K2 supplement that we're carrying, because the combination synergistically is so valuable for somebody who has that propensity. So that's more information for you, who is the person who's trying really hard to get to reversing that problem. Let me see if I've got any other. I've got a gentleman here who says that there are a lot of high-protein diets that suggest 100 to 200 grams of protein a day. But his question is, how much protein do we really need? And can a vegan/vegetarian diet actually accommodate that?
Yes. So that slide, one of those slides that I went over quickly, basically the amount of protein that a person needs is about sorry about this, 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. So if you know your body weight, you can change it to kilograms and then multiply it by 0.8. And that's the diet. That's actually the recommended levels from the Institute of Medicine. Some of the doctors who are working with entirely plant-based diets would suggest that even that level is more than enough and maybe too high, but it's a good starting place. For a person that weighs about 140 or 150 pounds, that's about 54 grams of protein a day. So if you weigh 200 pounds, it's going to be up in the 60s somewhere. If you weigh 100 pounds, it's going to be down in the 40s somewhere. So I always use that kind of 54, 55 as kind of a benchmark amount. 200 grams a day is too much, in my professional opinion. It's too much, even if it's coming from plant-based sources. It's too much relative to risk, particularly of cancer, and also of kidney disease and stone formation, kidney stone formation, and for bones.
That's excellent. And I have one final question for you, and this question is, which plant-based milk would you consider to be the most nutritious? For example, almond milk, hemp milk, all these other kinds of plant-based milks on the market.
That's always a hard question. I think one of the most important things is to, if you're purchasing your plant-based milk, if you're making it yourself from the nut or grain source, that's fine. You can drink as much of that as you want. But I would say for any of the plant-based milks, it's a good idea to switch them up sometimes, or keep two in your fridge, one that you maybe like better on cereal, or if you're consuming cereal, and one maybe that you put in your morning beverage, or that you use to make soup with or whatever. So, and the reason I say that is I think one of the reasons we've gotten into trouble with cow's milk is that we consume it multiple times a day. And if we were consuming a glass of almond milk a day and, had one coconut milk dairy food or dish made with coconut milk, like a curry or something, and had one soy milk product, for example, in a day, we wouldn't have the kind of immunologic responses that we see with cow's milk. Even with soy, which tends to be a little bit more immunologically, people tend to be more likely to have allergic or other intolerant symptoms to soy than they do most of the others. But I think if the use is limited, it's fine. So what I would do is, depending on what your goals are, is take a look at that nutrition panel on your plant-based milk and look for one that has a small number of ingredients and that has the kind of nutritional profile that you need. Some people are trying to limit fat, especially sometimes people are trying to limit sugar, and some are higher in sugar, some are higher in fat, but they're all fine.
Well, that was an excellent response. It is 9:02 Eastern Time, so we just have to thank everyone for coming out here, and we thank you, Dr. Lanu, for spending so much time with us and that excellent information you have. Fortunately, this has been recorded. For those that would like to have some more information, you can go back and re-watch this in a few days. I'm not sure exactly how long it'll be. Probably later in the week, maybe early next week, because our tech guy went off on vacation, so maybe a couple more days. But we will get this back on to get it, it is recorded, so people will get an opportunity. And we just thank everyone so much, and we thank you again, Dr. Lanu, and we look forward to seeing everyone again next month for another great experience with our webinars. Have a great evening and have a wonderful week. Goodbye.